Deep Secret by Diana Wynne Jones. Read by Christopher Webster and Harriet Carmichael. In the year EK 3413, the following files were secretly obtained from the Magid Rupert Venables and, at the Emperor's personal request, deposited in the new archive at Euphorion. Chapter 1. I may as well start with some of our deep secrets, because this account will not be easy to understand without them. All over the multiverse, the sign for infinity or eternity is a figure 8 laid on its side. This is no accident, since it exactly represents the twofold nature of the many worlds, spread as they are in the manner of a spiral nebula twisted like a Mobius strip to become endless. It is said that the number of these worlds is infinite, and that more are added daily. But it is also said that the Emperor Coryphos the Great caused this multiplicity of worlds somehow by conquering from I-wards to nay-wards. You may take your pick, depending on whether you are comfortable with worlds infinitely multiplying, or prefer to think the number stable. I have never decided. Two facts, however, are certain. One half of this figure 8 of worlds is negative magically, or nay-wards, and the other half positive, or I-wards. And the Emperor of Coryphos, situated across the twist at the centre, has to this day the figure 8 sign of infinity as its imperial insignia. This sign appears everywhere in the Empire, even more frequently than statues of Coryphos the Great. I have reason to know this rather well. About a year ago, I was summoned to the Empire capital, Euphorion, to attend a judicial inquiry. Some very old laws required that a Magid should be present, otherwise I am sure they would have done without me, and I could certainly have done without them. The Coryphonic Empire is one of my least favourite charges. It is traditionally in the care of the most junior Magid from Earth, and I was at that time just that. I was tired too. I had only the day before returned from America, where I had, almost single-handed, managed to push the right people into sorting out some kind of peace in the former Yugoslavia and Northern Ireland. But all my pride and pleasure in this vanished when I saw the summons. Groaning to myself, I put on the required purple bands and cream silk brocade garments and went to take my seat in the closed court. My first peevish, jet-lagged thought was, why can't they use one of the nice rooms? The great Imperial Palace has parts that go back over 1,000 years, and some of those old courts and halls are wonderful. But this inquiry was in a new place, lined with rather smelly varnished wood, bleak and box-like and charmless. And the wooden benches were vilely uncomfortable. The figure 8 insignia, carved in relief and painted too bright a gold, dug into my shoulders and dazzled off the walls and off the big wooden chair provided for the Emperor. I remember irritably transferring my gaze to the inevitable statue of Coryphos the Great, looming in the corner. That was new, too, and picked out in over-bright gilt. But there is this to be said for Coryphos. He had a personality. Though the statues are always the same and always idealised, you could never mistake them for anything but the likeness of a real person. He carried his head on one side, a bit like Alexandra the Great of Earth, and wore a vague, cautious smile that said, I hear what you say, but I'm going to do things my way anyway. You could see he was as obstinate as sin. I remember I was wondering why the Empire so loved Coryphos. He reigned for a bare 20 years over 2 millennia ago, and most of the time he was away conquering places, but they persist in regarding his time as the Golden Age. When we had to stand up for the entrance of the present Emperor, a very different person, small, plain and dour. You do wonder how it is that emperors always marry the most beautiful women in several worlds and yet produce someone like Timos the Ninth, whom you would hardly notice in the street. You would glance at him and think that this was a short man with weak eyes and a chip on his shoulder. Timos the Ninth was one of very few in the Empire who needed to wear glasses. This embarrassed me as I stood up. I was the only other person in the court in spectacles, as if I were setting up to be the Emperor's equal. In many ways, of course, a Magid is the equal of any ruler, but in this particular court of inquiry I was a mere onlooker, there by law to certify simply whether or not the accused had broken the law as stated. I was not even supposed to speak until after a verdict had been reached. This, among other legal facts, was tediously made known to me in the preliminaries after we all sat down and the prisoner was marched in and made to stand in the centre. He was a pleasant-looking youngster of 21 or so, called Timotheo. He did not look like a lawbreaker. I'm afraid that, apart from registering with some perplexity that Timotheo was an alias and that, for obscure legal reasons, his real name could not be given, I could not force my jet-lagged mind to attend very well. I remember going back to my thoughts of Coryphos the Great. He stood to the Empire in the place of a religion, it seemed to me. The wretched place had religions in plenty, over 1,000 godlets and goddities, but the worship of these was a purely personal thing. As an example of how personal, I recalled that Timos IX had, about 15 years ago, adopted the worship of a peculiarly unlovable goddess who inhabited a bush planted on the grave of a dead worshipper and who imposed on her followers a singularly joyless code of morals. This probably explained the Emperor's pinched and gloomy look. But no one else at court had felt the need to adopt the Emperor's faith. It was Coryphos who united everyone. Here I was jerked to alertness. The Emperor himself read out the charges against the young man in elaborate legal language. Stripped of the law talk, it was appalling, even for the Empire. The so-called Timotheo was the Emperor's eldest son. The decree he was said to have broken stated that no child of the Emperor, by any of his true wives, high ladies, or lesser consorts, was to know who his or her parents were. The penalty for discovering who they were was death, and death for anyone who helped an imperial child find out. The Emperor then asked Timotheo if he had broken this decree. Timotheo had evidently known no more of this decree than I had. He was looking as shocked and angry as I felt. I could have applauded when he answered dryly, "Sire, if I hadn't broken it before, I would have broken it when you read out my parentage just now." "But have you broken the decree?" the Emperor reiterated. "Yes," said Timotheo. Catch-22, I thought. I was furious. What a charade! The worst of it was that Timotheo was intelligent as well as pleasant. He would have made a much better emperor than his father. It had obviously taken some ingenuity to find out who he was. He had been one of the 4 fosterlings in the house of a provincial noble, and, as the inquiry proceeded, it became clear that the other 3 fosterlings and the noble must have given him some help. But Timotheo stuck to it that he had done the detective work and made the discovery by himself. Then he had made the bad mistake of writing to his mother, the Emperor's first consort, for confirmation. "Did it not occur to you that, once you were known, my enemies might kidnap you in order to threaten me?" the Emperor asked him. "I wasn't going to tell anyone," Timotheo said. "Besides, I can look after myself." "Then you were intending to claim the Imperial throne for yourself?" the Emperor suggested. "No, I wasn't," Timotheo protested. "I just didn't like not knowing who I am. I think I have the right to know that." "You have no right. You are convicted of treason to the throne out of your own mouth," the Emperor said, satisfied. He looked at me on my high, uncomfortable bench. "The law is the law," he said. "Bear witness, Magid, that this man broke our imperial decree." I bowed. I couldn't bear to speak to him. After that, there was a great deal of palaver, with other dignitaries getting up in their grand silks and bearing witness too. It got like a pompous dance. I sat there considering when would be the best time to spirit young Timotheo away, and I blame my jet-lagged state that I didn't do it there and then. He was looking stunned by this time. 6 men had just paraded past him, passing sentence of death on him, each swinging the white lining of their bright pink cloaks towards him. It was like being sentenced by a bed of petunias. I couldn't take it seriously. I reckon the best time to act was when they marched Timotheo back to his condemned cell. He had been brought in by a squad of elite guards, with a mage following for added assurance, and I assumed they would think no one could touch him through all that. I bided my time, and missed out completely. The petunias retired. The Emperor said, quite casually, "The sentence can be carried out now." He raised a hand glittering with rings. One of them must have been one of their beam weapons, miniaturized. Timotheo gasped quietly and fell over sideways on the floor, with blood running out of his mouth. It happened so quickly that I hoped it was a trick. I could not believe that, even in the Confronting Empire, an emperor would not want his eldest son alive. While I was climbing down the varnished wooden steps to the centre of the court, I was still sure it was just a deception, to make the emperor's enemies believe Timotheo was dead. But it was no trick. I touched Timotheo. He was still warm like a living person, but my fingers told me there was no soul there. I left at once, from beside the corpse, to make my feelings plain. I was thoroughly disgusted, with myself as well as the Emperor. As I made my way home, I told myself I had been stupid to expect compassion or even value for life in that place. And I had sufficient time to curse myself. Earth lies naywards of the Empire, which makes the journey rather like going slowly uphill. I had to haul myself from lattice to lattice in the spaces between the worlds. And by the time I reached my house, I not only hated the Empire, but also the stupid hampering robes it caused me to wear. I was just tearing the darn things off in my living room when the phone rang. I wanted nothing more than to sit down with a fresh brewed cup of coffee before calling up the senior Magid and lodging a formal complaint against the Emperor. I swore. I snatched up the phone. "Now what?" It was my elder brother, Will. "Bad day," he said. "Very," I said. "The Confronting Empire." "Then I believe you," he said. "Glad I don't have to look after that lot any longer." Will is a Magid too. "And what I've got to tell you won't make your day any better, I'm afraid. I'm ringing from Stan Churning's house. He's ill. He wants you here." "Oh, God," I said. "Why does everything unpleasant always happen at once?" "Don't know. It just does," Will agreed. "It's not a deep secret, but it ought to be." "I think Stan's dying, Rupert." "He thinks so anyway. We tried to get hold of Cy too, but he's out of touch. How soon can you get here?" "Half an hour," I said. "Stan lives outside Newmarket. Weaver's End, where I live, is just beyond Cambridge." "Good," said Will. "Then I can stay with him until you get here." And keep him alive if necessary, Will meant. If Stan really was dying, there would be Magid business he had to hand on to me. "See you soon," Will said, and rang off. I stayed in the house just long enough to make coffee and fax Senior Magid that I intended to complain about the Empire, to the upper room if necessary. Senior Magid lives several worlds naywards, and I normally make heavy weather of getting a fax through there. That day, I did it in seconds. 5 angry, trenchant sentences in no time at all. I was too busy thinking of Stan. I got in my car, still thinking of him. Normally, getting into my car is a thing I pause and take pleasure in, particularly if I've just been away for a while. It is a wholly beautiful car, the car I used to dream of owning as a boy. I usually pause to think how good it is that I can make the kind of money you need to own such a car. Not that day. I just got in and drove, swigging coffee from the thermos, with my mind on Stan. Stan had sponsored first Will, then our brother Simon, then me, into the company of Magids. He had taught me most of what I know today. I wasn't sure that I knew what I'd do without him. I kept praying that he, or Will, had made a mistake and that he was not dying after all. But one of the things about being a Magid is that you don't make that kind of mistake. "Damn!" I said. I kept needing to blink. I didn't consciously see any of the roads I drove along until I was bumping up the weedy drive of Stan's bungalow. A nasty bungalow. A blot on the landscape. It looked like a large cube of Stilton cheese dumped down in the flat heathland. We used to kid Stan about how ugly it was, but he always said he was quite happy in it. People who knew me, and particularly people who knew all three of us Venables brothers when we lived in Cambridge, used to wonder what we saw in a seedy little ex-jockey like Stan. They asked how we could bring ourselves to haunt his hideous house the way we did. The answer is that all Magids lead double lives. We have to earn a living. Stan earned his advising sheiks and other rich men about racehorses. I design computer software myself. Games, mostly. I parked my car beside Will's vehicle. At dusk, with the light behind it, it passes for a Land Rover. In broad daylight, as it was then, you look away and think you may have imagined things. I edged past it and Will opened the bottle green front door of the bungalow to me. "Good timing," he said. "I have to go now and milk the goats. He's in the front room on the left." "Is he?" I said. "Yes," said Will. "I've said goodbye. Shame Si can't be found. He's somewhere yonks eyewards and not in touch with anyone I can contact. Stan's written him a letter. Let me know how things go, won't you?" He went soberly past me and climbed into his queer vehicle. I went on into the bungalow. Stan was lying, all 5 foot of him, stretched on top of a narrow bed by the window. His slightly bandy legs were in child-sized jeans, and one of his socks had a thin place at the toe. At first sight, you would not have thought there was too much wrong with him, except that it was unlike him not to be wandering about doing something. But if you looked at his face, as I did almost straight away, you saw that it was strangely stretched over its bones, and that his eyes, under the high forehead left by his curly, grey, receding hair, were standing out like a cat's, luminous and feverish. "What kept you, Rupert?" he joked, a bit gaspily. "Will phoned you a good 5 minutes ago." "The Coryphonic Empire," I said. "I had to send a complaint to Senior Magid." "That lot?" Stan gasped. "She gets complaints about them from every Magid who goes near the place. Abuse of power, contravention of human rights, manipulation of Magids, general rottenness. I always think she just puts them in a file labelled KE and then loses the file." "Can I get you anything?" I said. "Not much point," he said. "I've only got an hour or so. No time to digest anything. But I would appreciate a drink of water." I got him a glass of water from the kitchen and helped him sit up enough to drink it. He was very weak, and he had that smell. The smell is indescribable, but it belongs only to the terminally ill, and once you know it, you can't mistake it. I remember it from my grandfather. "Shouldn't I ring the doctor?" I asked him. "Not yet," he said, lying back and panting a bit. "Too much to say first." "Take your time," I said. "Don't make bad jokes," he retorted. "So, well, here goes. Rupert, you're junior Magid on Earth, so it's going to fall to you to find and sponsor my replacement. But you knew that, I hope." I nodded. The number of Magids is always constant. We try to fill the gaps left by deaths as promptly as possible, because there is a lot for us to do. That was how Stan came to sponsor me as well as my brothers. 3 Magids died within 6 months of one another, long before Will was competent to try. Before that, Stan had been this world's junior Magid for nearly 10 years. As I said to Will, bad things always happen at once.
Now, there are several things I want to tell you about that, Stan went on. First, I've got you a list of possibles. You'll find it in the top left-hand drawer of my desk over there, on top of my will. Get it out of sight before anyone else sees it, there's a good lad.
What? Now? I said.
What's wrong with now? He demanded.
Superstition, I thought, as I went over to the desk. I didn't want to behave as if Stan was dead while he was still alive. But I opened the drawer and took out the folded list I found there. It's quite short, I said, glancing at it.
You can add to it if you want, he said. But look at those lot first. I spent all last month making sure you had some good, strong candidates. 2 of them have even been Magids before, in former lifetimes.
Is that a good thing? I asked. Stan was fascinated with past lifetimes. To my mind, it was his great weakness. He was ready to believe anything people said about reincarnation. It never seemed to occur to him that nobody who said they remembered a former lifetime ever remembered an ordinary one. It was all kings, queens, and high priestesses. He grinned, stretching his already oddly stretched face. He knew my opinions.
Well, if they bothered to get reborn, it has to mean they're keen. But you'll find a great advantage is that they're born subconsciously knowing after stuff, and usually with plenty of talent too. All my list are good strong talents, though. The best untrained in the world.
He paused a moment. He kept getting breathless.
And take your time looking at them, he said. I know we're supposed to be quick, but it's not that urgent. Do what I did. I left you for nearly a year. I couldn't mostly believe it, that 3 brothers in the same family should all be Magid material. Then I thought, why not? There has to be something in heredity. But I never told you what really made up my mind about you, did I?
My obvious superiority, I suggested. He chuckled.
Nah. It was the fact that you'd been a Magid before in at least 2 lifetimes.
In the ordinary way, I would have been extremely annoyed. I have never, I said stiffly, ever either remembered a former life or told you anything to suggest that I had.
There are other ways of finding out,
Stan said smugly. I let it pass. This was not the time to argue. All right, I said. I'll weigh up everyone on the list very carefully.
And don't necessarily choose the most willing. Run tests, he said. And when you do choose, make sure you let them follow you around during a fairly big assignment before you begin instructing them. See how they take it. The way I did with you over the iWorld pornography and with Will over the oil crisis.
What did Simon have? I asked. No one had ever told me.
A mistake on my part,
Stan admitted.
Someone was doing a white slave and marriage trade, pushing girls through Earth down from Naywoods and then on through the Coraphonic Empire. I let Simon see the police team the Empire sent here to see me about it. Half of them were centaurs. There was no way I could pass them off as Earth people. After that, I had to get him ratified as a Magid. He'd seen too much. Lucky for me, he's made a good one. But don't you worry that you'll make a mistake like that.
I should hope not, I said.
You won't, said Stan. Because if you start, I'll stop you.
I began, wondering how to point the hard truth out.
I'll be around, he said. I've arranged to be here. A Magid can work quite well, disincarnate, and I plan to do that until you've got things settled.
I said, half joking and wholly disbelieving. Don't you trust me not to balls it up, then?
I trust you, Stan said. But you've only been a Magid just over 2 years, and it used to be customary for all new Magids to have a disincarnate advisor. I found it in the records. So, I asked the upper room if I could stay and keep an eye on you, and they seemed to think it was reasonable. So I'll be around. Rely on it.
He sighed and stared into the distance somewhere beyond his flaking off-white ceiling. I sighed too and thought, Be honest, Stan. You just don't want to go away for good. And I don't want this to happen either.
Mostly, though, Stan added, is that I can't bear to leave. I'm only 89. That's young for a Magid.
I had not realised he was much above 60, and said so.
Oh, yes, he said. I've kept my condition. Most of us do. Then one day you get told, that's it, boy, death day tomorrow. And you know it's true. I've been given until sundown.
I looked out of the window involuntarily. It was November. The shadows were long already.
Call the doctor just before sunset,
Stan said, and did not say much for a while after that. I gave him some water, got myself some more coffee, and waited. Some time later, he began to talk again, this time more generally and reminiscently.
I've seen this world through a lot of changes, he remarked. I've helped clear away a lot of the political garbage that built up through this century. We've got the decks cleared for the changes due to come in the next century now. But, you know, the thing I take most pleasure in is the way we've managed to coax this world eyewards, gradually, surreptitiously. When I was a lad, no one even considered there might be other universes, let alone talking of going to them. But now people write books about that, and they talk about working magic and having former lives, and nobody thinks you're a nutcase for mentioning it. And I think I did that. Me. I slid us back down the spiral, back to where we should be. Earth is one of the early worlds, you know. Well, of course you know. And we should be a long way further eyewards than we are.
I know, I said, stressfully watching the shadow of my car spread over his bushy lawn.
Help it along some more, he said.
That's one of the things we're here for, I said. Later, when the room was getting dim, Stan said suddenly,
it was the homesickness that brought me back here, you know.
How do you mean? I asked him.
I started out my work as a Magid, a long way eyewards, he murmured.
His voice was getting weaker.
I chose it, a bit like Simon chose it. But I chose it for the centaurs. I'd always loved centaurs, always wanted to work with them. And as soon as I learnt that more than half the places eyewards of here have centaurs, off I went. I thought I'd never come back here, you know. Centaurs need a magical ambience to maintain them. Well, you know they do. And they all died out here when we drifted off Naywoods. And for 3 years I was blissfully happy, working with centaurs, studying them. I don't think there's a thing I don't know about centaurs and their ways. Then I got homesick. Just like that. I can't tell you what for. It was too general. It was just that the world I was on wasn't this one. It didn't smell right. The wind didn't blow like it does here. Grass the wrong green, small things, like the water tasting too pure. So, back I had to come.
To work as a jockey, I said.
It was next best to being a centaur, he said.
After a long pause, he added,
I want to get reborn as a centaur. Hope I can arrange that.
Then, after a longer pause still,
better phone that doctor then.
The phone was in the kitchen. I went through there and found the number carefully written on a pad laid by the phone. I remember thinking, as I punched it in, that this seemed hard on young Timotheo. I must have been one of the few people to be sorry he was dead, and yet all my sorrow was concentrated on Stan. I forgot Timotheo again the next moment. Stan had made his arrangements with care. The doctor, to my astonishment, answered the phone himself and promised to be there in 10 minutes. I rang off and went to the front bedroom. Stan? I said. There was no answer. He had fallen half off the bed as he died, and he had wanted to do that in private. I put him gently back. "Stan," I said again, into the dead, dim air. There was nothing. I could feel nothing.
"Well, so much for the idea of staying around," I said loudly.
But there was still nothing.
Chapter 2. A little before Christmas, when most of the other small and large things connected with Stan's death were done, I had a serious look at the list he had given me. There were 5 names on it, 2 of which were female. The addresses indicated that one of these women was British and the other American. The males were from Britain, Holland, and, I had to get out my atlas, Croatia. I sighed and tried to look forward to travelling to meet all of them on various invented excuses. At least 3 of them spoke my language. I could call that lucky, I supposed. Stan had also supplied the dates of birth for all of them except the Croatian. The British girl and the man from Holland were both young. She was 20, he was 24. That was a point in their favour. The other 2 were in their 40s. I found that a bit daunting. I had just been 26, and the idea of having someone so much older for a pupil filled me with apprehension. But I set to work to find them all. I do not wish to describe the frustrations of that search. With interruptions from my neighbour, of whom more hereafter, and my mother's natural desire to have at least one of her sons home for Christmas, I was divining, travelling, or querying my various sources non-stop for 6 weeks. I flew to Amsterdam to find the Dutchman, Cornelius Punt, only to discover that he had won some kind of scholarship enabling him to travel. He had taken serious advantage of it too. I went down to Avignon, where he was last heard of, and found that he had gone to Rome, Athens, and then Jerusalem. After a maddening 4 days dealing with the Greek and Italian telephone systems, I came home to find a fax from a Magid visiting Israel informing me that Punt had gone to Australia. I gave up and decided to wait for him to come back. My American contacts traced the older woman, Tansy Ann Fisk, soon after that. I was just preparing to fly out to Ohio when all sources sent urgent messages not to bother. Fisk had gone into retreat in some kind of all-female clinic where men were not allowed. Looking up this clinic in Magid records, I was a little perturbed to find it carried the remark, "Query dubious esoterica." Still, she could have entered the place in good faith for a simple rest cure. All I could do was wait until she came out. The British man, Mervyn Thurles, was equally hard to trace. Eventually, it emerged that he was on a lecture tour in Japan. As for the Croatian, Gabrielizovic, I don't have to remind you that there had been a war there. My NATO sources rather feared he was among the many who had vanished in it without trace. I turned to hunting for the British girl with some relief. At least we were both in the same country. Moreover, she was younger than me and possessed, according to Stan's list, the greatest amount of untrained talent of the lot. She was the one I secretly hoped to select. I even allowed myself very agreeable visions of her as a pretty and intelligent young woman whom it would be a pleasure to instruct. I visualized myself laying down the laws of the Magids to her. I saw her hanging on my every word. I looked forward to meeting her. I couldn't find her either. She had a slightly complex family history. The address I had for her proved to be that of an aunt, her father's sister, in Bristol, where Marie Malloy seemed to be a student. I stood on the aunt's doorstep in Bristol, in the pouring rain, while damp children pushed in and out of the house around me. Before long, the children formed a yelling, fighting heap behind the aunt. She shouted at me above the din that poor Marie had gone back to her mother in London. Didn't I know? Parents divorced. Sad case. I bellowed to be told whereabouts in London. She screamed that she couldn't remember, but if I didn't mind waiting, she'd ask her sister-in-law. So I stood for a further 5 minutes in the rain, watching the aunt across the fighting heap of children, while she telephoned further down the hall. Eventually she came back and screamed an inaccurate address at me.
I wrote it down, with further inaccuracies caused by damp paper and blotches of rain, and went to London the next day. It rained that day too. The address was in South London. That part I got right. But when at last I found it, it proved not to be called Rain Kitten, as I'd written down, but Grain Kitchen. It was a health food shop. The lady standing behind a glassed-in display of more kinds of beans than I knew existed was tall and slender in her white overall. The white cloth round her head revealed youthful fair hair. She was so young-looking and comely that, for a moment, I had hopes that she was Marie Mallory herself. But when I came nearer, she looked older, possibly even over 40. She could have been Marie's mother. My blotched notes said that in this case she would be a Mrs. Buttle, but the sign over the door had read, Proprietors, L&M Nuttle. I decided not to risk names. I told her politely that I was looking for Marie Mallory. She stared at me with her head on one side, in a summing-up way I found slightly ominous. "I'm not helping you," she announced at length. "Can you tell me why not?" I asked. "You think too well of yourself," she said. "Posh accent, shiny shoes, expensive raincoat, not a hair out of place. Oh, I can see well enough why you let her down like that. You thought she wasn't good enough for the likes of you, didn't you? Or didn't she iron your shirts to your liking?" I know I was speechless for a moment. I could feel my face flooding red. I do, certainly, like to be well dressed, but I found myself wanting to protest that I always iron my own shirts. It was too ridiculous. I pulled myself together enough to say, "Mrs. Nuttle, I assure you I have not let your daughter down in any way." "Then why is she so upset and saying you have?" the lady demanded. "Marie's not one to lie. And why have you come crawling to me? Realised you let a good girl slip between your nicely clipped fingernails, have you?" "Mrs. Buttle," I said. "Nuttle," said she. "I never did like men who wear cravats. What's wrong with an honest tie? Let me tell you, if I'd seen you when she first took up with you, I'd have warned her. Never trust the cravat, I'd have told her. Nor a mac with lots of little straps and buttons. Clothes always tell." "Mrs. Nuttle," I more or less howled, "I have never met your daughter in my life." She looked at me disbelievingly. "Then what are you here for, dripping all over my shop floor?" "I came," I said, "because I am trying to trace your daughter, Marie Mallory, in connection with a legacy which may come her way." The idea of a legacy was perhaps a poor one, but I was too flustered to remember all the cleverer pretext I had invented on my way to Bristol the day before. It seemed to impress Mrs. Nuttle. It was her turn to blush. Her fair pink skin went a strong purple, and she clapped both hands over her mouth. "Oh, you mean you're not this Robbie of hers, then?" "My name is Rupert Venables, madam," I said, hoping to rub the embarrassment home. "Oh," she said again. I assumed she was about to relent and summon her daughter from a flat upstairs or somewhere. Not a bit of it. "Prove it," she said, as her flush died down. And when I had shown her a business card, she said, "Anyone can have a card printed." So I produced my driving licence, a credit card, and my cheque-book. She looked at them long and hard. "I didn't bring my passport," I said, not altogether pleasantly. To which she said, "Well, Rupert's not much different from Robbie as a name." "There's all the difference in the world," I said. She returned to my business card and looked at it broodingly. "It says here, computer software designer. That's you?" I nodded. "And this Robbie is supposed to be training for a vet," she mused. "That is different. But why aren't you a lawyer if it's about a legacy?" "Because," I said, I am the executor of the will. The deceased, Stanley Churning, named me executor in his will. Mrs. Nuttle, much as I applaud your caution, I would be grateful if you would let me talk to Marie. I suppose I have to believe you, she said grudgingly. But Marie's not here. My heart sank. Where is she? Oh, she went to her dad when they found he'd got cancer, Mrs. Nuttle told me. She would go. It's not my fault she's not here. Do you mind giving me her address, then? She did mind. She was suspicious of the whole thing. I applauded her instinct, even while I tried not to grind my teeth. Eventually, she said, I suppose if it's over a legacy, and at last gave me an address north of Ealing. I thanked her and went there. It took hours, and when I got there, I found the house locked and the lower windows boarded up. A neighbour informed me that the owner was in hospital, a long way away, she couldn't remember where, and the daughter had closed the house up and left. I drove home, seething the whole way. The M25 was at a standstill. I tried to go cross-country and there were roadworks every half-mile. Talk about a run round the gasworks. I slammed my car door viciously when I finally got out in my own yard. I kicked my back door open and then slammed it shut. I tore off my damp Mac. I slammed cupboards hunting for a glass. I slammed my way into my quiet, orderly living room, poured a stiff drink, and threw myself into a chair. After the first swig, I had a thought. I swore, tore off my cravat, and threw it at the fireplace. If I'd only known what you were letting me in for, Stan, I said. If I'd known! As it is, I give up. Now. Why? What's the matter, lad? Stan's voice said. I stopped dead, with my whiskey tipped towards my mouth. Stan? Here, Rupert, his voice said, husky and apologetic, from the space by my big window. Sorry about the delay. It's not as easy to come back as I thought. It's not like you think. There's conditions to be met. I had to argue my case with the Lords of Karma as well as the Upper Room, and Lords of Karma aren't easy. Not all of them are human. I don't blame you for not looking happy. What's the problem? I think if Stan had arrived at any other time, I would have had trouble accepting him. Something about that unembodied presence brought me out in cold shudders, even annoyed as I was. But I was so fed up that I drank the rest of my whiskey in one gulp and told him what was the problem, and finished by yelling, "And it's all your damned fault!" Steady? Steady on, husked his disembodied voice. I had heard him talk to unquiet horses the same way. It isn't my fault. Another Magid has to be found, and you're going about it all wrong anyway. Wrong? I said. In what way wrong? You always were prone to it, he said. Going about it like a normal person and forgetting you're a Magid. You've got enormous powers, lad. Use them. Go after them the Magid way. Oh, I said. All right. But not until I've had a square meal, another stiff whiskey, and a pint of coffee. Does your present state remember the needs of the body? Can you wait that long? They've given me a year, these folk up there, he said. If you can be ready before then. That was the Stan I knew. I laughed. It made me feel better. An hour later, I took off my jacket. I was just about to hang it over a chair in my usual precise way when I thought of Mrs. Nuttle and threw it after my cravat. Then I rolled up my sleeves and got to work, with Stan's voice occasionally husking hints and shortcuts. It was a long evening, and a frustrating one. Thurles was thinking of staying in Japan permanently. Cornelius Punt had decided to go on to New Zealand. The Croatian and Marie Malloy were still untraceable. Well, they would be, Stan's voice observed, if they want to be. They're the two with a really strong talent. And Miss Fisk is probably having a nervous breakdown,
I added. That follows again, Stan said. It's the penalty of being odd when most people are normal. We might have gone the same way, you and me, if we hadn't been picked out for Magids. Speak for yourself, I snapped. My mood had gone bad again after this further frustration. I regard myself as a stable personality. Do you now? Said Stan. You forget. I knew you when you were a schoolboy. It's Marie. I agree with you, she's the most likely one. Dow's around for her father. He'll know where she is. They say fathers and daughters are always pretty close. I followed his advice, and it was excellent. A week later, I drove to a hospital in Kent and interviewed a tired, sagging, small man in a wheelchair who had already lost most of his hair. I could see that he had, only recently, been a fat little man with a twinkle. I could see the cancer. They hadn't done much for it. I was desperately sorry for him. I gave that cancer a sharp flip and told it to go away. He doubled up, gasping, poor fellow. Ouch, he said. First Marie, now you. What did you do? Told it to go away, I said. You should be doing that too, but you're hanging on to it rather, aren't you? Do you know? That's just what Marie said, he told me. I suppose I do. Hang on to it. It feels like part of me. I can't explain. What should I be doing? Telling the thing it's an unwanted alien, I suggested. You don't want it. You don't seem to me to have finished what you set out to do with your life. I haven't, he said sadly. First the divorce came along, now this. I'm not like my brother, you know, book after book. I have just the one thing. I would have liked to patent my invention, but, well... Then do it, I said. Where is Marie at the moment? In Bristol, he said. But I went to see her aunt and... Oh, she's gone to her other aunt, up the road. I made her go back, love affair or no love affair, money or no money. She's training to be a vet, you see, and it's not a thing you can stop halfway over. I'm afraid I wouldn't know, I said. Would I find her through the university, then? Or the damned aunt, he said. Ted's wife, Janine. Hateful woman. Can't think why my brother married the bitch, frankly. Made even more of a mistake than I did. But Ted stuck by his, for the boy's sake, I suppose. He gave me the address, maddeningly enough, in the same street as the house I'd gone to before, and then said anxiously, It's not really true I can get shot of this cancer by just thinking, is it? A lot of cancers do respond to that, I said. I'm not so good at thinking positively, he said wretchedly. Before I left, I did what I could for Derek Mallory. It was no good hitting the cancer when he was embracing it so fervently, so I hit a few centres in his brain instead, trying to turn him into a more cheerful way of thinking. I suspect he felt every hit. His face puckered like a baby's. I thought he was going to cry, but it turned out that he was trying to smile. That helped, he said. That really helped. I'm all for the mind stuff. Deep down, really. I've often argued with Marie about it. She can do it, but she won't. Make scathing remarks instead. She lacks belief. That's her problem. So, I went back to Bristol again. But not until a week had passed. First, I had to earn my living. I had a lot of deadlines to meet that week, and I would have met them too, with time to spare, except that as I was sorting the last and most intractable problems, my fax machine began making the little fanfare of sound I had set it to make when it was bringing me Magid business. I went and picked up the sheet. It said, Euphorion, 10th of February, 3413, 1100 hours. Urgent. Emperor assassinated. Come back to Euphorion Imperial Palace soonest for immediate conference.
This message by order of the Acting Regent, General Commander Dakros.
Oh, good, I said. Hurrah!
That was my first reaction. That man Timos the Ninth really had it coming, and not only because of Timotheo either. I hoped the assassin had hurt him first, rather a lot. Then I thought again and said, oh shit, no heir. Then I thought again and added, and what am I supposed to do about that? I'm their Magid, not their nursemaid.
Tell them to go whistle,
Stan suggested. He was evidently reading the facts over my shoulder. I faxed back that I would come tomorrow. They faxed back, Euphorion, 10-2-13, 11:04 hours. Urgent. Imperative you come now. Dakros. I faxed again. Why? I'm busy here with Magid business. Dakros, whoever he was, faxed in return. We got the assassin's accomplices. We're dealing rebellion/other chaos. We need you to find the next emperor. Real problems there. Only a Magid can solve it. Please, sir. Dakros. It was the please, sir, that got to me. The man was a general and acting regent, and he was saying that, like a small boy pleading. I faxed that I was on my way, and, since it sounded like the kind of problem you have to spend time on, I started to pack an overnight bag. Doubtless I could borrow stuff, but in the Empire they slept in a thing like a hospital gown, tied up with tapes, which I dislike, and I hate their razors. I could feel Stan hanging over me as I packed, wanting to say something. What is it? I said.
Don't get too involved in that Empire, will you?
He said. No fear. I hate the place. Why?
Because there's a sort of directive out to Magids about it. Not as strong as an intention, more of a suggestion, to leave the place to go to hell in its own sweet way.
It can, for me, I said. What directive is this? A deep secret you forgot to tell me, or what?
No, it's something I picked up while I was over there, negotiating with the Lords of Karma and so on, he confessed. I had to go even higher up in the end. It came from a long way up.
Them up there want the Empire left alone. Happy to oblige, I said, hurling my washing things into my bag. I zipped it up and set off downstairs. Are you coming to Euphorion with me? There was an unhappy pause. It lasted while I hurried from the stairs and into the living room. Then Stan's voice husked.
I don't think I can, lad. I think I'm fixed on Earth. I may even be stuck to this house of yours.
That's boring for you, I said.
There's no rule that says life, I mean afterlife, has to be interesting, he said ruefully.
I sensed him hovering wistfully in the middle of my living room as I set out for the Empire. It took several moves, from lattice to lattice, with its attendant feeling of being a pawn on a chessboard hopping from square to square, but downhill, since I was moving eyewards. I thought as I went that Lewis Carroll got it right in Alice Through the Looking Glass. No one had ever told me, but I have always suspected that Carroll was a Magid. It is a very influential thing to do, to write books like the Alice books, and influence is what being a Magid is all about. Subtle influence. Chapter 3. I emerged in Euphorion, as before, in the small cubicle in the palace they called the Magid Gate, and found myself in a room full of dust, pungent, old, bricky dust. My eyes and nose instantly streamed. I got my handkerchief out, started to blow my nose, and then changed my mind and held it over my nose and mouth as a filter. While I was dumping my bag in a corner, 2 soldiers edged into the tiny room.
Posted to take you to General Dakros, sir, the man said hoarsely.
They surprised me, and not only because they appeared so suddenly out of the dust. One was a woman, and both were younger than me. Their uniforms were of a very low-ranking kind, dark blue and grey, such as I had seen only in the far distance before, herding aside those of the common people who were allowed within, or probably just beyond, shouting distance of the Emperor. Both looked deeply weary. It was in the way they moved, as well as their pale faces and dark circled eyes. The man had clearly not shaved for several days. The woman's hair was clotted with grey-red dust. "If you'll keep close to us, sir," she said, as hoarse as her companion. "Parts of the building are dangerous." I saw what she meant as we set off into the fog of brick dust. Almost at once we turned sharply into a domestic-seeming corridor, a low, stone-floored passage I had never seen before. When I craned back to look at the corridor I was used to, I had a glimpse of sky there among bent and splintered girders. I could hear quite heavy pieces of masonry dropping from higher up. I jumped at the first crash, but the soldiers took no notice. It was happening all the time, and they'd obviously grown used to it. "Was the place bombed?" I croaked. "Big bomb in the throne room," the man replied. "Blew a hole through the middle. Weakened the structure," the woman added. "Took out all the chiefs of staff and the council, too." "And all the Imperial wives," said the man. "Lot of important clerks killed when the service rooms caved in." "Lot of military, too," said the woman. "Elite guard was surrounding the throne room," the man explained. "Nearly all got crushed." Not to speak of the Emperor, too, I thought. Bullseye. Nice timing, whoever you were. All the top echelons of the Empire at one stroke by the sound of it. It made me shiver and want to laugh at the same time. I put on a suitably grave face under my handkerchief and stepped cautiously after the two uniforms. Even in this safer corridor, the flagstones had heaved up here and there. In places, the stone ceiling bulged downwards. We kept close to the walls where that happened. At length, after a long and roundabout walk, we arrived in the doorway of an arched stone vestibule. It glared with some kind of emergency lighting, making the hanging dust into a sort of bluish pea souper. My glasses were coated by then. I had to take them off and clean them before I could see anything through that fog. While I wiped at them with my gritty handkerchief, I was aware of my two soldiers pulling themselves into smart attention with an evident effort and snapping slightly flaccid salutes. They said, in hoarse unison, "Magid Venables has arrived, sir." Inside the light, a tenor voice said, "Thank goodness." Another person coughed hackingly, and a third, deeper voice said, "Great. Get him in here." I put my streaky glasses back on and advanced. Considering what the soldiers had said, I suppose I should not have been surprised by the people currently in charge of the Empire. But I was. They sat, the three of them, in various attitudes of deep weariness, at a table crowded with stuff. The tenor voice belonged to a wizard, mage, or whatever they call themselves in the Empire, who looked younger than I was. His eyes were so red with dust that I thought at first they were bleeding. One of his arms was actually bleeding, or had been. He was using the pompous short cloak the Empire decreed for its magic users, very sensibly, as a sling. Its gilded infinity sign glittered off his left elbow. The one coughing was female, a very pretty lady, even through streak upon streak of soot and brick dust, most oddly dressed in a pair of striped drawstring trousers and a blouse thing sewn with sapphires and pearls. The third one was clearly General Dakros. He wore the blue and grey uniform of the second-grade soldiery, as far as I could see it. It was torn and dusty, and in places burnt. Like his private soldier, he had not shaved for some time. His chin was blue-black, matching his close-cut, wriggly black hair. He was evidently from one of the swarthier races of the Empire, those not selected for the elite troops or high responsibility, and though this had saved his life, it had thrust upon him the shattering demands of running the Empire. His face, as he turned to me, had a hunted nightmare look, hollowed at the temples and with muscles clumped at the blue jaw. But his eyes, I was glad to see, looked at me and appraised me quite sanely. He was older than the rest of us, but young for a general, from which I deduced that he was good at his job. He turned away almost at once. There was a second arched doorway across the vestibule, and several figures emerged from it as I walked to the table. materialising out of the dust fog with quiet urgency. 2 laid faxes on the table. 1, in the gold and royal blue of the elite soldiery, but looking drab and strained, came and muttered respectfully in the general's ear. I was glad to see that respect. It proved that this Dakros really was in charge. It was some urgent talk about a captured world gate. While it went on, I examined the table, which carried swathes of dust-covered faxes, several portable battle computers, a mind speech receiver, something I wouldn't have minded owning myself, and more empty plastic coffee cups than I could count. The elite guard left, and Dakros turned back to me. By this time I was coughing nearly as hard as the pretty woman. I said, "General, you have to get out of here before you ruin everyone's lungs." "I know," he said. "There's just been a new fall. We'll get out as soon as you've helped us solve our problem." "It's in the throne room vault, you see," the woman said. The young wizard put in a tone of fretful pride, "I am doing what I can to keep it all up." He was, too. I realised when I sent my senses upwards. There were tons of masonry, and it was half killing him to support it. I did what I could to help shore it up. Stan might have objected, but I didn't care. The whole broken palace seemed to be on the slide. The young wizard gave me a grateful grimace as I slid my supports in around his. "We'd better make it quick, then," I said. "Which way is the throne room?" The general heaved himself to his feet. He was a fine, tall fellow, even sagging with weariness as he was then. "We'll show you." As the other 2 stood up too, he seemed to recollect the manners of yesterday's empire. "Oh, sorry. This is Junior Mage Jeffros, and this is the High Lady Alexandra. The High Lady is the only one of the Emperor's consorts who survived the blast." At this, the High Lady gave me a shamed sort of smile, as if she'd been caught stealing the jam or something. Perhaps one would feel guilty, I thought, when others of much higher rank had died. The mage Jeffros evidently did. As we all hurried away down another long stone passage, he told me, "I was just left sitting in the rubble. All the senior mages around me were killed. I feel really bad about that. It was so senseless that it should have been just me left." The passage led us to a sort of canyon open to very blue sky. Broken building towered on either side, sliding. I could feel it sliding. I hastily did a lot more shoring. Then I looked at the canyon floor and, with difficulty, recognised the Imperial throne room, mostly by the shattered patterns on the floor, the remains of age-old mosaic littered with its own little stones and fragments of stained glass. The remains of the dais were at the other end. There was a black bowl scooped in the dais where the throne had been. Otherwise, nothing. I whistled. They must have collected the Emperor and his staff in shreds, if at all. "How on earth did you escape this?" I murmured to the High Lady. "I was in the toilet," she murmured back. She said it with defiance, but defiance that was in some way worn out. Poor girl, I thought. She's been having to admit to it for hours, to soldiers. "Don't talk here," Jeffros whispered. "And don't walk in step," the general added. He stepped carefully into the middle of the skylit canyon and walked lightly and swiftly towards the dais. The rest of us pattered after him, stepping in blank areas that had once been priceless designs in semi-precious stones, crunching through rubble and glass shards, and setting little cubes of mosaic rolling. Meanwhile, the cliffs of masonry on either side grumbled softly and, in places, suddenly subsided, letting out squirts of dust. I found it terrifying. But halfway along I was distracted by something worse. It was the smell of, well, sewage, garbage, butcher's shop and gunpowder, I suppose, with a strong reek of ozone. I gagged quietly into my handkerchief. Ozone, I thought. Ozone is frequently an aftermath of magic. I felt about mentally, as far as I could bear to. Yes, the bomb that did all this had been guided and triggered by magic. It must have been one of the Emperor's senior sorcerers on a suicide mission, I guessed, who had done it. A brave man. Or maybe a desperate one. We mounted the dais beside the scooped hole where the smell was nearly unbearable. And I found there was a roof over the back of the platform and a wall behind that, which seemed almost intact. Though the roof bent and creaked and sifted dust on us, my instant anxious probing revealed that this part of the building was immensely strong, reinforced with girders, granite and magic. Good. We could relax a little. If the Emperor's throne had been set just 2 feet further back, he could have been relaxing too. It was dark under there. All I could make out was the black hole of a doorway, with a hugely thick door hanging out of it. Jeffros reached out with his good hand to touch a wand that had been rammed upright into a crack in the dais. It flared like a torch, and so did a line of such wands, into the distance beyond the door. I could see glimpses of some kind of installation in there. The light also showed the door to have buckled in foot-thick waves, as if it had been under the sea. Wow, I thought. My 3 companions were already climbing over the doorsill into the secure chamber beyond. I hurried after them. It felt quiet in there, and safe, and it was almost dust-free. I took my handkerchief off my face and used it to clean my glasses again. After that, I could look properly at the ranks of screens, keyboards and computers which the Emperor had used to control the 11 worlds straddling the waste of infinity. "We're going to have to blow all these up before we leave," the General told me gloomily, "in case someone gets in and tries to use them. This one seems to be the one we need. It won't let Jeffros divine its purpose." "And I was told he kept information about the succession separate from everything else," the High Lady Alexandra explained. I slid into the red leather bench in front of the machine the General pointed at. It started up fairly readily. There was some kind of emergency battery in it. "Explain the problem," I said as I watched the basic programming coming up on the screen. "It's not harmed in any way. It just told me so." "We got that far too," the General said, with a touch of sarcasm. "I wouldn't let him go beyond that," Jeffros said. He looked strained and ill. "You'll find it's got magic protections." I had already seen those. They did not seem very formidable. I boxed them out and typed in a command for the names and whereabouts of the Emperor's children. Nothing. I tried heirs for children. Again, nothing. Then, with memories of that mock trial last November, I typed Timotheo and got a response. "Male, born 3392, codename Timotheo, deleted 3412. "Deleted," I said. "That's a fine touch. What was his real name, then?" "We don't know," said the General. Well, at least this did seem to be the machine that had the answers, I thought. "Tell me the code names for the other children, then, and how many of them there are." "Again, we don't know," said the General. "We're not even certain there are any." "Oh, I think there were," said the High Lady Alexandra. "There were rumours of at least 5. I swiveled round on the red bench. "Look here. I got a fax 2 years ago, just after I took over as Magid for the Empire. It recorded the birth of a girl to a lesser consort called Jalela. That's one, at least." "Wasn't true," said the General, and the High Lady added, "Poor Jalela had been dead nearly 14 years then." The General gave me a look that was more than a touch sarcastic. "Beginning to see the extent of our problem, eh, Magid?" I was. My face must have been expressive. Jeffros looked up at me from stringing lengths of flex between his wands. "This empire," he said, "was built of planks of delusion across a real cesspit. You don't have to tell us, Magid. The Emperor was so scared of being tossed off the planks that he did a great deal more than just hide his children." "Hid them even from themselves and issued false bulletins about new births," Dakros said.
Cut the moral stuff, Jeff Ross. That's our current problem. Thanks to Lady Alexandra, we're fairly sure there are some heirs, and the question is, can you find them, Magid? I looked him directly in his weary face. Do you really want to find them? Since they don't know who they are, and you don't either, wouldn't it be better just to start all over again with a new emperor? You seem to have made a start yourself. He had grown more outraged with every word I spoke. He interrupted me vehemently. Great and little gods, Magid. Do you think I'd want to deal with this mess for the rest of my life? I want to go home to Thalangia and run my farm. But I know my duty. I've got to leave the Empire in order with a proper person on its throne. That's all I'm trying to do here. All right, I said. It needed to be asked. But let's hope this proper person of yours has a watertight birth certificate, or a birthmark, or a tattoo, or something. Or half the Empire is going to say he's a fraud if we do find him. Do they? I asked Lady Alexandra. Get some kind of mark at birth? I've no idea, she said. Then I take it you're not the proud mother of an heir yourself, I said. Even in the queer, flaring light of the wands, I saw how she coloured up, and she wrung her hands in an involuntary, distraught way. Dakros made a movement as if he was going to hit me, but stopped as she answered sedately, I've never had the honour, Magid. My sense was that the Emperor didn't like women much. And thought he was going to live forever, I said disgustedly. He was only 59, she told me. Oh, what a mess, I said. So what do you know? Only rumours, as I said, she answered. She shamed me. She was being polite and she was trying to help, and here was I getting progressively ruder and more irritated. But then the Empire has an atmosphere, and always gets me down, and it was worse then, in that dusty ruin with tons of masonry hanging over our heads. I heard, Lady Alexandra said, of at least 2 girls, and there may have been 2 boys besides the one who was executed recently. I think Jalala may have had a son before she died, but I wasn't a consort then, so I don't know for sure. Thank you, lady, I said. I turned back to the computing machine. Beside me, Jeffros crawled to attach a wire to its cabinet, awkward and one-handed. He shamed me too. He was getting ready to explode the place as soon as I came up with something, and all I was doing was getting waspish with the general and the lady. I'd better come up with something quickly. The thing that was making me most irritable was the way I could feel the ceiling, despite its magic, creaking and faintly shifting above us. I typed away unavailingly for a minute. The screen kept giving me the news that Timotheo was deleted. I scowled at it. Surely even a paranoid fool like Timos the Ninth must have envisaged a situation like this. There had to be some reasonable way to locate and identify his heir. Even if he had thought that whichever counsellor or mage also knew the secret was going to survive him, there still had to be a way. The ceiling creaked again as I tried a new way. Ah, a new message. Enter correct password or penalty ensues. I tried the infinity sign, but that was too obvious. I tried Coryphos, since someone had just mentioned him. No luck. It was Lady Alexandra who had mentioned Coryphos. Something about Coryphos the Great coming back to rule the day the Imperial palace fell. As I tried the word Timos, I heard the general say, "Stupid story." "It isn't all down yet," Jeffros put in. While he was speaking, the machine whirred and came up with another message. 3 passwords incorrect. Penalty ensues. The ceiling creaked once more, loudly. "Someone find me a copy disk," I said. "Several. We need to get out of here." I could feel the magics up there shredding away as I spoke. A safety device. Anyone not in the know queried this machine, and down it all came on top of him. The Emperor didn't care. If that happened, he knew he'd be dead. Of all the stupid, selfish... "Quick!" I said.
The High Lady Alexandra arrived at my side with a box of copy discs. She wasn't just a pretty face then, but I'd begun to realise that anyway. On my other side, the General proffered 2 more. I snatched one, snapped it in, and commanded the machine to copy. "Do you think it will?" the General asked dubiously. "No," I said, "but I'm going to make it." I have seldom worked so hard or so fast as I did then. With one mental hand, as it were, I held together the unravelling magics overhead. With the other, with everything else I had, I forced that damn machine to copy its entire contents at speed, high speed, onto disc after disc. I had only managed 4 when I felt the overhead magics escaping me. I left the 5th disc in there and swung off the bench. "Come on! Run! All of you!" They'd all been staring upwards uneasily. They did not need to be told why. The General left at a sprint, managing to call into his battlecom as he ran. "Clear the building! Roof's about to go!" Jeffros and I took the High Lady Alexandra by an arm each and hammered desperately after him. We chased across the ruined mosaic floor with slow-motion landslides beginning on both sides of us, and tore along a stone passage that seemed endless. Long before the end of it, I was hawking for breath, far worse than the lady, far too breathless even to try to stop the palace going. I just ran, hearing the long, slow grinding of a mountain of building collapsing overhead, forcing myself to run faster, swearing to keep myself in better condition if I ever got out, and running. We pelted out onto a terrace of steps above a vast courtyard. All along the length of these steps, shabby, uniformed figures shot out of other doorways and ran too. The General and everyone else wisely kept running, down the flight of steps and on out into the courtyard. We panted after them, with chunks of stone crashing and bouncing at our heels. The General stopped in the middle of the courtyard beside the huge statue of Coryphos the Great. The rest gathered in a ragged group around him, no more than a couple of hundred or so, surprisingly few people to hold down an empire. "The Emperor had just cut back on the army," the General said sourly, seeing my surprise, and swung round to look at the palace. I was beyond speech by some way. My chest burned. I could only heave up breath that hurt and stare at that huge building folding in on itself and the dust boiling up from it. Jeffros, who looked as if he felt far worse than I did, shot me a look that said, "Why not?" and snapped his fingers. There was a sulky boom somewhere in the midst of the vast grinding, and the dust boiling out sideways was suddenly orange with fire. "Oh! Oh!" Lady Alexandra cried out. As the building spread itself majestically into a heap of scorching rubble, the General put an arm around her. "You'll find a new life, my lady," I heard him say through the astonishing noise of it all. And I thought that when General Dakros finally went home to Thalangia, wherever that was, he would not be going alone. I don't know how long we stared at the palace. I remember we all seemed to want to wait for the outlying wings, each of them with a row of vast turrets, to collapse with the rest, and that these took quite a time to go. More people came running into the courtyard from there, so that by the end we were quite a large crowd of shivering, orphaned, dusty folk, all staring at the end of the seat of a government we had thought would never end. I know I felt as stunned as the rest. The empire I had loved to hate was simply not there any longer. My breath came back in slow stages. When I had merely trembling legs and a sore chest, and the ruin in front of us seemed to have stopped moving, I turned to General Dakros and passed him 2 of the 4 copy discs. "There you are," I said. I was hoarse as a crow. "One to work on and one backup. Warn whoever works on it to have a magic user standing by. That program is almost certainly designed to wipe if anyone tries to use it anywhere but on that machine." I pointed my filthy thumb at the rubble. "I've done what I can, but it will need reinforcing when you try to run it." I was, to tell the truth, quite worried about that. I'd wrapped all 4 discs in every protection I could think of, but I didn't have exact enough knowledge of the Emperor's methods to know what to protect them from. "What are you going to do?" Dakros added. "I'm going to take the other 2 discs home and work on them there," I said. "Could you let me know anything that you find out from yours? You have local knowledge I don't. And I'll fax you when I've got something. He responded by pointing his thumb at the vast heap of rubble and gave me a wry look. I remembered that the fax machine to which I was tuned was somewhere under there. So was my overnight bag. I'll call you, I amended. Give me your Battlecom number and I'll tune it to my fax machine at home. He gave me the number, looking doubtful. But how will you get home now the Magid gate is gone? That was only used by custom, I said. I can go from anywhere. He looked so surprised and respectful that I felt that I had been boasting, and I had, a little. Some places you can't make transit from, but there was no problem with the courtyard. I said, see you soon, I hope. Then I walked out across the court, the uphill Naywood's way home. Chapter 4. The first thing I did at home was to put the 2 discs into plastic with magically enhanced protection and then lock them in a drawer. I did that even before going to the bathroom and coughing up what felt like 2 pounds of brick dust. Then I showered and changed my clothes. By that time I felt slightly less shaken, but still too shaken to get back to work. I decided to take my filthy clothes to the cleaner instead, and buy a new razor on the way. I was on my way out of the house when I heard piano music, loudly from the living room. I opened the door. The Diabelli variations were coming over my CD player quite thunderously. I don't remember leaving that on, I muttered, going to turn it off. You didn't, Stan's voice said. He sounded slightly ashamed. It was in there and I found I could do that, turn it on. It's the kind of brain music I seem to fancy in this state. I can turn it down if you'd rather. The music became suddenly blessedly faint. It's all right, I said. I'm going out. Enjoy yourself till I get back. When I got back, the same CD was still playing. It finished and started all over again while I was in the kitchen finding something to eat. I stood it for half an hour and then went in there. Want me to put a different CD on for you? I asked. No, Stan said. This suits me fine, but I'll lower it right down while you tell me what's been going on. The Diabelli variations once more sank to a distant tinkling. Invitation hung in the air. It seemed pretty clear that Stan was bored. It had not occurred to me before that a disembodied person could be bored, but why not? There was a bomb in the throne room, I said, and sat down and told him the rest. Those discs will wipe, he said decidedly, when I had done. If there are any kids, no one will find them, and that will be that. There'll be 6 tramped-up emperors in the next year, and then the whole thing will fall apart. No more empire. Just what's supposed to happen. Maybe, I said, but I'm professionally bound to try to help, even though it almost certainly means ruining a computer over it. You can do that in your spare time if you want, he said. Don't forget your main job is to find a Magid to replace me. You better go to Bristol tomorrow. No, I said. Not with a computer puzzle like this one hanging over me. I couldn't concentrate. I did not want to say I was sick to death of the fruitless Magid hunt. I thought of every other possible excuse instead. Stan protested. We argued for the entire length of the Diabelli variations. As they started yet again, I said, to placate him, All right. I'll write the 4 we know about a letter, asking them to get in touch with me. How does that grab you? I'd be surprised if anything grabbed me in this state, Stan retorted. Fine. What are you going to tell them? Different things, depending, I invented. Thurles is a writer. I can send him a fan letter. Mallory's a student. She'll want money. I've already told her mother she's got a legacy. I can write about that. Fisk sounds as if she would be interested in a new miracle cure. And Cornelius Punt... Yes, said Stan. My invention, which had been flowing so freely, dried up on Punt. He's been travelling. Ask him if he's interested in doing a travel book, Stan suggested. Good idea, because I knew he'd give me no peace until I did something. I wrote the letters then and there. I was rather pleased with my artistry. Regardless of the fact that I had never even seen a book by Mervyn Thurles, I wrote lyrically of the beauties of his style. To Mallory, I wrote that she had inherited £100. I reckon I could just about afford that much. To Tancian Fisk, I was the friend of a friend of a friend who had heard that she was in a clinic and wanted to tell her about the marvels of the Stanley diet. To Cornelius Punt, I was a small publisher touting for interesting books. "What's this Stanley diet?" Stan said at my shoulder. "Airy nothing, like you," I said. "I thought so," he said. "Go on, take the mickey, I don't care." I posted the letters and then, at last, Stan allowed me to get on with the Empire discs. It took me the next 3 days. I started studying one of the discs by every Magid means that were relevant. When I thought I knew enough about the nature of the program and the safeguards implanted in it, I stripped down my oldest computer and started forcing it to become Empire compatible. This was a major task in itself. The Empire used a different size and shape of copy disk, different power and a more streamlined approach to programming. I had to render the metal and plastic of my poor old Amstrad into a sort of jelly and then harden it into the correct form. I had to create a power adapter. Then I had to program it to reflect, as near as I could conjecture, the nature of the machine I had copied the discs from. This was the hardest and most finicky part of all. I can safely say that only a Magid could have done it. I remember remarking to Stan, "Lucky I'm in practice with this sort of thing. It's probably cheating, but I use Magid ways a lot in my ordinary programming. Did you use Magid methods with your horses?" There was no reply. I heard the diabelli variations again coming from my living room. "I bet he did," I murmured. There's almost no way not to. It seems to permeate everything you do, being a Magid. Sometimes it's so nebulous as to seem like intuition. Sometimes, when you hit a fierce problem, there seems no way forward without, and you push, the way I was pushing that program then. At the end of the first full day, I was ready for a trial. I put in the Empire disk and told it to copy to the hard disk. It resisted all my attempts to make it, even when I very cautiously took the protections off it. So I sighed, put the protections back, and told it to display its files. Nothing. I pushed, unwisely. The computer went down so comprehensively that things melted inside. Small flames played over it, and I only just saved the power adapter. I did not want to have to make another. I swore. I had to make haste to study the fused and mangled remains while they were still hot too, which was no fun. There turned out to have been no fewer than 3 magical safeguards embedded in that program, 2 major mistakes in my attempt at the Empire's software, and several more in my adaptation of the unfortunate Amstrad. I spent the evening feverishly tracing pathways. "What did that fool Emperor think he was playing at?" I said irritably to Stan, through the tinkling of the CD player. "You'd almost think he'd said, 'I can't be Emperor when I'm dead, so I'll make sure nobody else can.'" "Maybe he did," Stan said. "But some of the other ones who were blown up must have been in the know. He maybe relied on them. It doesn't matter. You don't want to get involved." "It's the people who matter," I said, thinking of the strained nightmare look on the face of General Dakros. "There's an ordinary, honest man over there, trying to cope. There are millions of other ordinary people who could get slaughtered when the men of high rank in the other 10 worlds start to move in on Dakros. There's going to be an almighty civil war. It may have started already." "Don't get sentimental," said Stan. "Either the high rankers will win, or your general will get a taste for ruling and keep the Empire for himself. These things happen." That night in bed, I had to admit he was right. But I also wanted to solve the problem. The next morning, I got a letter from young Mallory. The hard-up student had replied by return of post. "Dear Mr. Venables, I don't mind admitting I could use £100. I shall be at this address until July, so you can send the money any time. But do you mind telling me just who left me this legacy? I am an adopted child. I know nothing of my real family, and I thought they knew nothing of me. Yours, M. Mallory. A graceless and slightly suspicious letter, I remarked to Stan.
Yes. You get quite a feel of her from it, he said. You'll know her if you see her across the street after this.
He was right. The letter was full of a personality. The paper had evidently been borrowed or purloined from the uncle. It was headed, in Gothic type, "From Ted Mallory, author of Demons Innumerable," and printed on a hideous dot matrix printer with almost no ink. But it all breathed a very strong personality. A nuisance, her being adopted, I fretted. Who on earth can her legacy be from?
Me,
said Stan.
Say I did research and thought I was her uncle. I did have several very randy brothers, so it could even be true.
I dashed off a courteous note to this strong personality, saying that I would give her the money and explain its origin in person shortly, and got back to work on my second oldest computer, a Toshiba I'd barely touched for a year. It was hard, detailed going, and it put me under pressure, knowing that I only had the one disk left. I wished I had not left two with Dakros now. In fact, I became harassed enough towards the end of that day to get through to the com number Dakros had given me and ask him to spare me another. The answer came back, a prompt and laconic fax. Both disks melted. Damn. And I really did not want to melt another computer. There seemed to be nothing for it but to cross my fingers and put the second disk in. "Virus detected," announced the Toshiba. I got the disk out quick. But at least I was on familiar ground here. I clicked my tongue at the paranoia of the Emperor and set about dismantling the virus. It was a magical implantation. It was like undoing old lace.
"Aren't you going to eat today?"
Stan asked a while later. I looked up to find night had come, early, since it was early in the year, but time to stop for a bit. I made a cup of coffee while I wondered what to eat. Next thing I knew, I was in front of the Toshiba again. It was after midnight, but the virus had gone when I tried the disk.
"You're getting obsessed with that Empire,"
Stan warned me. "Correction," I said. "I'm obsessed with a computer problem. It's not every day I get a magical virus." The third day, I actually got the program to copy and display. That was a relief, since I could now reshape some of my own disks and make backups. But it did me no good. All I could get on the screen was the statement that Timotheo was deleted and the perpetual password required. This was maddening, since I had been behind the scenes of it, so to speak, dealing with the virus, and ought to have been able to bypass the need for a password. But if I tried that, I got nothing at all. And I did not dare push, Magid fashion, for fear of another meltdown. Stan heard me swearing and drifted into my workroom.
"Give it a password, then," he said. "And when you've a moment, put me another music disc on, would you?"
"What's the matter with Diabelli? Have you learnt it by heart?" I said.
"Every note,"
he said, quite seriously.
"I know Beethoven like a friend now."
I put him on a choral medley, because that made a change, and got through to Dakros again. The reply was from the mage Jeffros. "Empire passwords are usually 7 letters. We didn't try many, because the disks melted at every third mistake. But the High Lady Alexandra suspects the word may have been from a nursery rhyme." A nursery rhyme? Well, Lady Alexandra was definitely not just a pretty face, and the suggestion fitted, as we were dealing with children here. Empire nursery rhymes are not so different from Earth's. They're one of the things we Magids put into circulation. But 7 letters, like a mad hand of Scrabble, in any one of the 14 languages spoken in the Empire. Actually, I was full of hope as I went to set up one of my other computers to run through all the possibilities. I think my only problem was surprise that Timos IX knew such things as nursery rhymes existed. Just then, I heard Stan's new music lustily bellowing, "In Babylon, the mighty city," It gave me a frisson. Babylon is one of the deep secrets of the Magids, but it was, for this reason, also a nursery rhyme. I went to the Toshiba and told it Babylon. It was right. World maps began to unfold on the screen, empire fashion, rippling with lines like isobars on weather charts, map after map, world after world, like half of infinity. I leant back and watched them, wondering why the Emperor had chosen this particular password from this particular rhyme. Babylon was never a place in the Empire. After a while, a moving frieze of graphics appeared, humans and centaurs passing in profile across the shifting maps. They had the look of real people taken from photographs, and they all seemed to be different. But it was hard to tell if they were intended to be meaningful or just an indication that the program was now truly running. Finally, the screen cleared. Letters said, "Type Naros." I typed Naros. "Now type the name of my goddess," came the reply. I turned frantically to the computer that held my Empire database, knowing I was going to be too late. "Stan!" I shouted. "Stan, what's the name of the Emperor's dismal goddess?" "Can't remember," he shouted back across what seemed to be the Hallelujah chorus. "Some damn great mouthful." I remembered it myself. Aglaia Eualeia. Just as the disc wiped. "And that's the man who knew every racehorse from 1935, I said. "Well, at least I have backups." I did it all over again. By the early evening, I was ready again, this time with a list of various other gods, heroes, and historical personages from the Empire, just in case. I had developed a hearty respect for the Emperor's paranoia, but it seemed that the name of his goddess was his last resort. I typed Naros, followed by Aglaia Eualeia, and a list came up. Naros, Code World, Lixos. Female, born, 3390, codename, Natalia. Female, born, 3390, codename, Fizzler. Female, born, 3400, codename, Anante. Male, born, 3401, codename, Eklos. Male, born, 3402, codename, Magrakes. Plus 2 male centaurs, born, 3394 and 3396. Code World, Babylon. Female, born, 3393, codename, Timotheo. Male, born, 3399, codename, Jaliro. Each of the names was followed by clumps of letters, numbers, and signs, which meant nothing to me, but which I supposed were the Empire's version of blood groups or genetic codes or some such. The two lists were followed by the statement, "Naros will supply identification and authentication of heirs only to accredited messenger on proof of the death of Timos IX. "Gotcha!" I said. I opened a bottle of wine to celebrate before I endeavoured to get through to Dakros on his comm number. After the fun and games of the last few days, it was a simple matter to splice him into my telephone. I got him after half an hour, sounding far off, crackly, and very tired. "2 sets of them," I said, "on 2 code-named worlds." I read him what they were. He was nothing like as jubilant. "Who is this Naros?" "Some kind of guardian, I imagine." "He might come forward when he hears—" "Well, he hasn't," he said. "And which bloody worlds are Lixos and Babylon meant to be?" "You could get the Imperial Secret Service onto it," I suggested. "I could, if they weren't all mindless gangsters," he retorted. "We executed most of them yesterday, trying to stage a coup. And," he returned to what was obviously the main difficulty, "I don't like the way it all seems to hang on this Naros. You have to go through him for the eldest boy, even if it is on another world.
What if he's untrustworthy or someone does him in?
Blame the stupidity of your late ruler, I said.
I don't like it, he said.
Neither do I said. The fact that the password was Babylon still made my back creep. I've faxed the list to Jeff Ross. Let him put people to work on it and tell him to let me know if you need my help.
I'm bound to, he said. This is a stupid, over-secretive mess.
I rang off, sighing. He's going to want me to find Babylon for him. I can see it coming.
You can't do that,
Stan said sharply. I think we're talking about two different things, Stan, I said. Or at least I hope we are.
Mind turning that music down?
I've got a headache. Chapter 5. I drove to Bristol the next day with a passenger. I had not meant to go so soon, in spite of Stan's nagging. It seemed to me that I had earned a day with my feet up. But my neighbour rang my doorbell just at the point where I'd drunk enough of the wine to quench my headache. Andrew Connick is a strange fellow, an inventor. Unlike the unfortunate Derek Malloy, Andrew has succeeded in pushing his creations out of his head into reality, and he holds several dozen patents, all for very useful gadgets. My favourite coffee pot is one of them. Andrew gave it to me to test. Like me, he lives alone, in one of the only two other houses in Weaver's End, which is bigger and fancier than mine. It has a large garden with a pond in it, which I sometimes envy him for, until I think of all the digging and weeding Andrew has to do. The third house in Weaver's End contains the Gibbs family. Mrs. Gibbs cleans my house. Her daughter cleans Andrew's. Mrs. Gibbs tells me her daughter says Andrew Connick is a very strange man, and I believe her, though I also believe that Mrs. Gibbs tells Andrew that her mother says Rupert Venables is pretty strange too. He was standing on my doorstep, looking as if he was not sure why he was there. "Hello, Andrew," I said. "Come on in." I suppose Stan would have the sense to keep quiet, even though choral music was blasting out around me.
"I'll no come in," he said in his distrait Nordic way.
Actually, I believe him to be Scottish, but I think of him as Nordic because he has that bleached, handsome head and those large bones I always associate with Scandinavians. He is very tall. I'm just under 6 feet, and he towered over me, looking uncertain.
"No, I'll not enter," he said. "I just came to ask you to give me a lift tomorrow."
"Car broken down again?" I said. My heart sank. The last 2 occasions Andrew's car had failed him, between Christmas and New Year, I had clocked up over 600 miles shuttling Andrew and various spare parts between here and Cambridge, and Ely and Huntingdon and St. Newts, not to speak of Peterborough and King's Lynn.
"Aye," he said. "It won't be moving."
My heart rebelled against more shuttling. I had earned a rest. "I'm so sorry," I said. "I'm not going to be here tomorrow. I've got to go to Bristol." He was silent, with his large pale eyes on the distance above my head, evidently thinking. After a while he said, "I'll come to Bristol then." I had a mad feeling that if I had said I was going to drive to Carlisle, Edinburgh, or Canterbury, he would have agreed to come to any of those places too. "It's quite a way," I said, in a last-ditch effort to dissuade him. "I'm making an early start." He thought about that too. "I can be ready by 6. "Oh, for God's sake, I didn't mean that early," I said, giving in. "Let's say 8:30, shall we?" "I'll be there," he said, and left. So I found myself committed to driving to Bristol. "Are you coming with me?" I asked Stan. "Or do you think you might frighten Andrew?" There was one of Stan's unhappy pauses. Then he said, "I don't think I can, lad. I seem to be confined to your house." "Are you sure?" I said. "Where else have you tried to go?" "Beyond the garden gate.
past your barn at the back. I couldn't manage either direction," he said. I was annoyed. It had been a tiring few days. "What's the good of having a ghostly advisor if you can't be around to advise me?" I demanded. "I was relying on your opinion about this girl." "Then stand on your own feet for a change," his voice retorted. "It's what them up there seem to want you to do." I knew I'd hurt his feelings. He did not speak to me again that night, and I heard not a word from him in the morning, not even when I arranged for him a floating stack of CDs, each one magically programmed to hop in or out of the CD player when he gave it the word. I was proud of that magic, and I considered it thoughtful too. So I was offended in my turn. I went out to my car in chilly silence and found Andrew waiting beside it. Andrew is actually a good passenger. He does not make conversation, or talk about other motorists, or make nervous comments on how fast I drive, which is fast. He just sits there. This sometimes gets unnerving. When I got particularly unnerved, the first time was 2/3 of the way around the M25, I asked him about his latest invention, and he told me in his deceptively slow and meditative way, which nevertheless described the thing. He called it a swing ratchet, so accurately that I could probably have done drawings and patented it myself. Then he stopped talking. Somewhere down the M4, I became unnerved again, but I felt it was my turn to tell him something. Usually, when I drive him anywhere, I tell him about any software problem I have lately run into. Very often, he has set me on the right lines, just with one of his slow, wandering responses. This time, however, my problems had been something of a deep secret. There did not seem to be any way to talk about them. Or was there? In a world tending naywards like ours, no one is going to suspect you are talking about a collapsing empire 3 universes away. "Tell me," I said, "what would you think if you found the password you needed to access someone else's program was a sort of secret code word the programmer shouldn't really have thought of using in that way? I mean, suppose the password was something silly like Humpty Dumpty, to a very serious program, say something about genetics, and you knew that Humpty Dumpty was actually a code word for something equally serious, say classified military information. What would you think? Would you put it down to coincidence, or what?" Andrew said ruminatively, "I'm told there is no such thing as coincidence." I was told that too, and, what is more, told it as a Magid, which made it very significant. But it seemed to me that Andrew was just uttering a platitude. I was disappointed. He said, "Is there no chance the user of the password hacked into the other classified material?" I said, well, it's always possible, to cover up what I was really talking about, and added, "But it's unlikely to many decimal places. Virtually impossible, in fact." "If it's that unlikely," Andrew meditated, "then I reckon you have to go back in time, to some wee point where the code word was known to someone who told it to both parties, a teacher who recited Humpty Dumpty, to take your example, and both users learnt it from him. And this teacher would have given both of them the idea that the words were somehow important, maybe. But that is not essential." "That," I said, "is very true." I drove digesting this thought. Were Magid's secrets known in the Corophonic Empire sometime in the past? I did not think they were supposed to be known there now, any more than they should be known here on Earth. There are some things that even Iwood's world should not know yet. But there are always hints, vestiges of knowledge, both from the past and the future, that Magids leave for people to pick up when the time is right. Babylon was certainly one of those. I suppose it worried me that Timos the Ninth was an unlikely person to be interested in such a hint. Here Andrew startled me, the way he often did, by saying musingly, "There is very seldom any true secret."
Right, I said. Things get out. Look at King Midas and his ass's ears. I don't think either of us said anything else until we reached Bristol, and he asked to be dropped by the nails. I got lost getting him there. It was midday or after when I finally dropped him. When do you want to be picked up? I asked him. Oh, he said, and thought. Then he gave the smile that always made me realise he was not the absent-minded fool he often seemed. It changed his distraught, neurotic face quite radically, so that you saw there was a deep mind behind it. I'll find my own way home, he said. I don't know how long I shall need to be here. That was a relief. It meant my time was my own. I found a promising Italian restaurant and treated myself to a good leisurely meal. Later, I was glad I did. The rest of that day was pure frustration. It was typical of the hunt for Mallory. And I still don't see how she did it, but I am sure now that it was all her doing. First, I lost the place where I'd parked my car. When I found it, it had acquired a parking ticket. Then I got lost again driving to Mallory's new address, regardless of the fact that I had been to the street before, and when I did get there, there was nowhere to park, in that street or the next. It was after 3 when I finally rang the bell of the tall, smartly painted Regency house. The woman who answered the door was as smartly painted as the house. She would probably have been good-looking in a dark, gypsy-ish way, if she had not worked so hard at it. Under the makeup, her face had the look of someone who dieted fiercely. Her dark hair had been enhanced with bronze streaks, and her strenuous slimness enhanced by a tight black skirt and a designer jumper. The jumper fascinated me. It was one of those which have a white satin pattern, sewn with beads, randomly appliqued to one shoulder. It was the most pointless pattern I'd ever seen. So fascinated was I that it took me a moment even to realise that she was too old to be Marie Mallory. She was in her mid-30s at least. She tapped the door frame with a shapely red fingernail and said, "Yes," impatiently. "I'm sorry to disturb you," I said. "I'm looking for Marie Mallory, about a legacy." As I spoke the name Marie, her face hardened. It was clear she hated Marie, and now disliked me by association. "I'm afraid my niece has just gone out," she said. I could tell she was pleased to frustrate me. I said, "Have you any idea when she might be back?" "Not the foggiest," she said, with evident pleasure. "When my niece takes it into her head to go gallivanting, it's anyone's guess how long she'll be gone." Then she added, as if it were a major tragedy, "She took my son Nick with her too." Her manner suggested that Marie had torn the infant from her arms. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said to both things. "Do you know where they've gone?" "All I know," she said with satisfaction, "is that she drove off almost the moment you rang the doorbell." She was right to be satisfied. It is always worse to know you have just missed someone. In the normal way, that is. But for a Magid, that is not such bad news. "Thank you," I said humbly. "Perhaps you could tell your niece that I called." I gave her a business card. From the way she took it, I could tell that it would be in the waste bin in pieces seconds after she shut the front door. I gave a last fascinated look at the design on her jumper. The satin had scalloped edges and 2 beaded tendrils that impinged hungrily on her right breast, and went away. Janine, I thought. That had to have been Janine. Poor sick Mr. Mallory had correctly pronounced her to be a bitch. Then I dismissed her from my thoughts, jumper and all, and took out the letter Marie Mallory had written me. Everyone leaves traces of themselves in the air as they go. These last for 10 minutes strongly, and can be detected for another 20 minutes after that, or more if the person has a powerful character. In letters, traces of personality can linger sometimes for 50 years. And Marie Mallory had left her strong character all over that letter. All I had to do was match it with any nearby traces. They were just up the street, those traces. mixed with pungent blue smoke from a car in dire need of an oil change. I remember at the time misguidedly finding the traces rather agreeable. They had a valiant, pugnacious, and even humorous feel, as if Malloy, despite the misfortunes that had evidently befallen her recently, was holding herself together and fighting fate. And Janine had been quite accurate. The girl had been driving out of one end of the street literally as I walked into it the other end. I was, again misguidedly, delighted. I sprinted back to my car and set off in pursuit. I followed these traces for half an hour. They led me on a tangled trail, through streets broad and narrow, under other streets, over bridges, downhill, uphill so steeply that once I stalled my engine, and out along small snaking roads across green parkland. I saw Regency terraces, pink Gothic towers, modern office blocks, cobbled alleys, Brunel's iron ship, and the M32. From the map that I had spread out on the seat beside me, I reckoned, with growing exasperation, that I had seen every part of the city north of the harbour, and all without once coming within hailing distance of the car I was following. I hadn't even identified it, let alone discovered what the girl thought she was doing. But since the narrower streets where she had been were invariably pungent with oil, I guessed I was looking for a fairly old car. Guessing is a mistake. You should keep to the traces. About this point, the trail plunged steeply down to the waterside again. Following it, I saw ahead of me a small, dingy Morris with a woman driving and a child seat in the back. Aha! I thought. I gave chase, sending Magid messages to the driver to draw in somewhere and talk. There was no response. I pursued the Morris across 2 branches of river into a place where a one-way system induced mad circularities and the growing amount of traffic reduced both of us to a crawl. The Morris was always 3 cars ahead of me, and its driver refused to respond to my messages in any way. My frustration mounted with every yard. I would have given up, except there she was, so near. Then the brown Morris abruptly turned off into a side road, and I realised it was not the right car after all. The traces of Malloy had completely vanished. I had probably lost them from the moment I assumed the Morris was hers. I cursed. I decided to give up and drive home. Then, with uneasy thoughts of Stan's comments, I supposed that the obvious thing to do was to drive back to the aunt's house and lie in wait there. I set out to do that, but by then, of course, I was lost again. I fought through the ever-increasing traffic, looking for a bridge, and no bridge appeared. Instead, I found myself, to my bewilderment, driving steeply uphill on what was almost a country road. The traffic was appalling. We crawled. More cars came crawling up behind me. I had ample leisure to see I was driving along one side of a very considerable ravine, and that the whole of Bristol was now spread out or piled up on the other side of it. That settles it, I thought. I'm driving home, and resigned myself to having to do it via Wales or something. But at that point, the traffic ahead speeded up. The city vista vanished behind trees, and a notice by the road stated that I could turn right for Bristol via toll bridge. I turned right, thankfully. And the toll bridge, when I reached it, was a perilously high suspension bridge across the gorge, a ribbon of road hung from cliff to cliff between 2 quasi-Egyptian towers. I put money in a slot and rumbled across it dubiously, sparing glances through its sides at a muddy trickle of river flaring in the sunset some hundreds of feet below. Some fool had stopped a car in the middle of the road just beyond the bridge. I nearly ran into it. I stamped on my brakes. Squeals behind me told me that a line of other motorists was doing the same. Not only was the car stopped, but its driver's door was open, blocking what was left of the road. There was no room at all to get by because the road was divided by a steep curb to stop cars going the wrong way on the bridge. Motorists were stopped on the other side of this curb, staring. The way they stared told me that my first idea, that this was an accident, was wrong. This car had been stopped deliberately. Then I saw its driver. She was dancing, dancing on the sidewalk beside her car. She was a small, unlovely woman in glasses, with a figure like a sack of straw with a string tied round it. And she danced. She bent her knees, she hopped, she cavorted. Her rag-bag skirt swirled, her untidy hair flew, and her spectacles slid on her barely existent nose. Beside her, her passenger also cavorted. Both of them waved their arms, both bounded about. He was a teenage boy, dark and startlingly handsome, and he towered over her in his dancing, rather sheepishly. He had the air of one who was only dancing because she was not going to drive on unless he did. I exonerated him. As for her, I put my thumb on my hooter button and held it there. I was not the only one. The woman stopped twirling, but only to bend at the knees and shoot out her fingers. Those fingers were adorned with nails long enough to be classed as murder weapons. Flick, 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 towards the road. It was a totally contemptuous gesture. The boy did the same, self-consciously. I could see they were both singing or chanting something as they flicked. Then, calm as you please, they both went back to dancing. I was angry enough to augment the sound of my horn with a blast of magic. It fair bellowed. Behind me, the bridge was jam-solid and half the cars on it were hooting too. The boy at least noticed. He looked unhappy. But the woman went on dancing and he obediently imitated her. They did another flick, flick, flick of the fingers, this time in the direction of the rocky bank. And then they danced some more. I lost my temper. I took my thumb off the hooter, I turned off my engine, pocketed my keys, and got out of my car. They were doing another flick, flick, flick as I reached the woman's car. Her keys were inside it, dangling from the ignition. I nearly slammed the door on them. Except that then she would have had to pick the lock to get in, and no other car would be able to move until she had. Instead, I stalked round the bonnet of her car and confronted the capering pair on the pavement. Luck, 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 they were chanting. Flick, flick, flick. Do you mind holding your Sabbath somewhere else? I said. I had meant to say much more, but I had got so far when the traces of her personality hit me. She was Mallory. Of course. She had done nothing but lead me a dance all along. She stopped dancing. She turned to me as if I had just crawled out of a sewer. Then, with immense disgust, she put one of her outsized fingernails to the bridge of her glasses and looked me up and down all over again. Two can play at that game. I took my left lens between my finger and thumb and focused the look right back at her. Marie Mallory, I presume, I said contemptuously, before she had quite got round to speaking. Get lost, she said, as she had been meaning to say all along. She had an unpleasingly loud, gloomy voice, with a sort of sob embedded in it. Then, belatedly, she registered what I had said. You may know me, she retorted, but I don't know you, and I don't want to. Beyond her, I saw the boy, who must be Nick Mallory, and not the infant Janine had implied, looking as if he wanted to get down and lie under her car. I was angrier than ever. It was the sob in her voice, I think. Rupert Venables, I said, or rather snapped. I wrote to you. I let go of my lens and brought out my wallet. I've been looking for you all over town to give you your wretched legacy. Here you are. I held out to her in a fan the 10 notes I had made ready to support my story. She looked dumbfounded, and, as I had hoped, she automatically put out her hand for the money. I counted the 10 notes into it with angry ceremony. There began to be yells, whistles, and cheers from the motorists watching across the road, and from some of those behind, who were now either hanging out of their windows or standing irritably beside their cars. Mallory's face turned a dull, furious red. Her cousin's dark face was redder still. Mallory's chin bunched and her hand flinched, as if she wanted to throw the notes into the road. But the money meant too much to her. She hung on to it. 10, I said, making 100. Now will you please get into your bloody car and drive it out of my way? She did not answer, just strutted haughtily to her open door to further hoots and cheers from the line of motorists. The boy folded himself in through the other door with the speed of an early silent film. "Was it worth the money, then?" the driver of the car behind mine called out as I went back to my own car. I wanted to say it was indeed worth £100, just to be able to wash my hands finally of Mallory and her family, but I could hardly explain why. I simply shrugged and smiled and got behind my wheel as Mallory started her car with a leap and roared away in a cloud of blue oily smoke. Her car was nothing like as elderly as the brown Morris. She just didn't look after it, evidently. I was glad I did not have Andrew with me on the way back. I was able to swear the whole way home. I arrived, still raging. "What's the matter now?" Stan asked from my dark living room, over the remorseless rhythm of a Bach fugue. "Mallory," I said, snapping on the light. "If anyone wants to make that girl a Magid, it will be over my dead body. She's unspeakable, and ugly with it, besides being mad." And I angrily described my day's adventures. "Did she show any talent at all?" he asked. "I'm sure she has bags of it," I said. "Enough to keep me away from her all day, which is where I want her to stay. I don't want any part of someone who uses their talent to hold up rush-hour traffic by dancing widdershins in the street. Not even ashamed of it, either. At least her teenage cousin had the grace to look embarrassed." "Look on the bright side," Stan said. "Mallory can't behave like a Magid. So, you've eliminated one candidate. Now you can start thinking about the other 4. "What fun," I said savagely, and stormed into the kitchen. I said to myself as I tore open the fridge, "And how am I supposed to look at 4 people when they're scattered all over the globe? Japan, New Zealand, Bosnia, Ohio? Oh, fun!" Stan had evidently followed me. His voice said at my shoulder, "I've been thinking about that." I slammed the fridge shut. "Don't do that!" "When you've had something to eat and cooled off a bit, I'll tell you," he said.